Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there's been several advances across the eastern section of the front line within the Donetsk region. The Russians have here advanced west of Bilorivka in this direction of Siversk, to the north and to the west of Toretsk, where they are advancing beyond the outskirts of the city. The Russians also managed to advance west of New York, gaining control over several fortified positions of the Ukrainians. Advances continue west of the fortified positions in between that of Toretsk and the intersection between Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk. Russians also managed to advance further in the northern direction within the town of Novolenivka, gaining control over fortified positions there. The Russians also managed to advance west of Pokrovsk in the direction of Novoalexandrivka and Troitske. Starting out in the southern section of the front line near Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to reach the outskirts of Troitske, gaining control of the first line just outside of the town, both in the northern flank of Bohdanivka and in the eastern flank of Troitske. The Russians are here looking to gain control over all three towns of Troitske, Bohdanivka, and Horyhove, where they'll be attacking Bohdanivka from the north and from the south, Troitske from the east and from the north, following which the Russians will have an open road from Bohdanivka towards Horyhove from the south and through Troitske and into Horyhove directly. With this, the Russians will look to gain control over the border area and potentially launch offensive operations to cut off the main supply road for the Ukrainian forces in the towns of Oleksivka to Dashne, cutting off the highway from Novopavlivka and potentially threatening the town itself across the border area. Also allow the Russians to have a buffer zone between their control over their towns and the Ukrainian positions in Novopavlivka, allowing for offensive operations on the flank of the fortified positions north of this town line. The Russians also managed to advance northwest of Nadiivka, where they are fighting over the fortified positions northwest of the town, and they also managed to gain control over the forest line here west of the supply road that supplies the Russian forces on the town of Novoalexandrivka. To the east, the Russians have made several advances from the east of Toretsk to the west of the city. The Russians managed to gain control over fortified positions here west of Novolenivka, gaining control over the fortified position across the river line as they continue fighting over control of the town and the fortified positions near it. The Russians also managed to advance here southeast of Zelenopole, where they're looking to gain control over the fortified positions here near Kalinove for offensive operations in the direction of Nativka and Oleksandropil. The Russians also managed to gain control over several fortified positions near Sukhabelka, advancing along the fortified positions in between that of Sukhabelka and Stara Mykolaiivka, both in the northern and southern defensive line. The Russians also advanced to the rear of these defensive positions in the direction of Romanivka, where they're looking to gain control over those defensive positions, storm Stara Mykolaiivka from the west, cutting off the Ukrainian forces and completely encircling them. The Russians are here looking to gain control over both of these defensive groupings of Ukrainian forces, which will allow them to have an open road towards the fortified positions near the towns of Nativka, Soria, Stara Mykolaiivka, Oleksandropil, and Romanivka, allowing the Russians to gain full control over the pocket here in between Toretsk and the intersection. The Russians also managed to advance here north of Toretsk in the Deliivka forest area, where they're looking to gain full control of it, advance along the road towards the fortified positions near the industrial area, cutting off and encircling the Ukrainian forces in the northern parts of the city, while also connecting their forces from the Deliivka forest area towards Deliivka and through Dashne towards Deliivka, encircling the Ukrainian forces northeast of Krymske and gaining control over the towns in the northern flank. Gaining control over Deliivka will also allow the Russians to continue offensive operations here northeast of Dashne, where they've gained control over additional forest lines and forest patches and fortified positions, where the Russians are looking to connect their forces from Deliivka with those forces there, cutting off and encircling some of these fortified positions in between the two towns, and looking to gain control over the northern flank of Dashne as well for further offensive operations to connect their forces within Toretsk in the south to Decisive in the north. The Russians also managed to advance in the west of Bilorivka, where they're fighting over the fortified positions near the forest patch areas and the forest lines. They also managed to advance within Hryhorivka itself, gaining control over some additional basements on the eastern outskirts of the town. The Russians are here operating with just a few soldiers, less than a squad, within the town. Their main focus is along the forest lines and fortified positions to the south of it. The Russians are mainly focusing offensive operations in the direction of the Donetsk region and within it, from which we can see that there are several areas of focus of the Russian forces, with two main areas that are surrounding the cities of Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk. To further explore the goals of the Russians in these directions, we have to look at prior Russian offensive operations, such as the battle over Bakhmut, where the objective of the Russian forces is really to gain control over supply lines, leaving only a single road in and out of the city, while enveloping it from both sides, putting the Ukrainians in a semi-encirclement. If we take the same idea with Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk, we can determine exactly what the Russians will look to do. Putting Kostyantinivka in a semi-encirclement would leave this singular road to the northwest under Ukrainian control, while all other roads would need to be under Russian control. They mean the Russians would need to cut off the roads here to the west, southwest, southeast, and east. The Russians already control the eastern roads, as they are present within the eastern and southern directions. That means that there are two roads that the Russians need to cut off, and those are the roads here to the west. The Russians also need to be within close proximity to have fire control over the final road. Similar case in Pokrovsk, the Russians will need to cut off all of the roads in and out of the city except for the northern road, which goes deep into Ukrainian territory. This means if we take a look at the fortified positions, the location of the towns, the proximity to the next lines of defense and so on, we can easily determine what the Russian objective will be. For the Russians to gain fire control over the main roads and supply lines that would remain under Ukrainian control during the siege of both cities, we have to take a look at what towns are within close proximity to these cities. In the northwest of Pokrovsk, there's Rishine, which is a larger town here to the northwest of the city, and then there's the eastern flank, where Mirnorad is too large for the Russians to fight over, so it will likely be enveloped as well together with Pokrovsk. This means the Russians will take a step further east, and that would be the town of Novoekonomichne here to the east. So for the Russians to gain control over these towns, the Russians will look to gain control over the river line here near the town of Myrolyubivka. The Russians would then cut it off at the northern outskirts of the town, from which they will look to gain control over the towns ahead of the line of defense of the Ukrainians in this area. That means they would need to gain control over Shevchenko Perche, Popiv Yar, Poltavka, Rusin Yar, and then eastwards. The Russians would look to gain control over areas such as Mykolaiv to the north, Doverbelka and Stepanivka. However, Ilinivka and Bereztok is too close to Kostyantinivka, therefore it will cut off there and connect at the reservoir. This would be the eastern flank of Pokrovsk and the western flank of Kostyantinivka. For the western flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians would look to gain control over the border area and cut it off at Serhivka to the south of the main highway, or if they want to completely cut off all roads except for the northern highway, they would need to go a step further along the border area towards Kamyanka and gain control over this series of towns along the northwestern road outside of Pokrovsk. So that is the western flank of Pokrovsk. Finally, the southern and eastern flanks of Kostyantinivka would be connected through the reservoir to Ivanopilya, here to the southeast of Kostyantinivka, along the towns of Predeshine, Stenki, Popasne, and Vyrolyubivka, all the way up to Markove. With this, the Russians would have close proximity to both of the cities to cut off all roads except for a singular road at the northern outskirts of the city, leaving just one road open, and to be within close proximity to that road to have full and complete fire control of them. Now, if we take a look at the Russian offensive operations, they all point in these directions. We can see that the Russians are focusing in these directions to gain control over these areas, fighting over the towns and fortified positions to cover these positions. The total area that the Russians will need to capture is approximately 1,100 square kilometers. The Russians have captured about 37 square kilometers within this area over the past 2 days, putting at an average of about 18 square kilometers a day. This would mean it would take about 60 days for the Russians to gain control over this vast amount of territory, within these marked out areas. And this is why I believe that within this summer period, the Russians will look to gain full control over Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk by the end of summer, which would lead to the final siege of the Sloviansk-Kostyantinivka line, which would at that point be the Sloviansk-Droshkivka line, which is a much smaller. The Russians would also simultaneously be fighting over Liman during this summer period, potentially also capturing Siversk by expanding the zone of control around Decisive Yar and the high ground, as well as the fortified positions ahead of Sloviansk, Droshkivka, Kostyantinivka line. All of this would lead to the Russians gaining a significant advantage within the Donetsk region and potentially gaining full control of the Donetsk region by the end of the summer without launching any major offensive. Therefore, the logical conclusion is that the Russians could reasonably gain full control over the Donetsk region by the end of the year without launching any major offensives. If the Russians do launch a major offensive, that process could speed up even further, and they could also manage to capture additional parts of the front line in other sectors, such as the Zaporizhia, Kherson, the Kharkiv, Sumy, or Chernihiv regions. The Russians have immense potential during this summer period where the ground is hard, the weather is optimal for offensive operations, and the Russians have a significant advantage in manpower and firepower. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.